My husband asked for divorce after my dad died. Certain he'd get half the money. He thought my inheritance would make him rich overnight. But my father had planned for his greed long before he ever filed the papers. My name is Amanda, and I need to tell you about the most painful yet liberating experience of my life. It started with small things I should have noticed but chose to ignore. My father, Jair, had never been one for many words. But around my husband, Julio, his silences became almost deafening. During our Sunday dinners at his modest two-bedroom house in suburban Portland, Dad would nod politely when Julio launched into his latest business schemes. But I caught those moments when his weathered hands would pause mid-reach for his coffee cup, his gray eyes studying my husband with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Amanda, your father seems distracted lately," Julia would say on our drive home, his voice carrying that slight edge I'd learned to recognize. Maybe he's getting too old to keep up with real conversation. I defend Dad, of course. He's just tired from work. Engineering projects drain him. But deep down, those seeds of doubt Julio planted would take root. Was Dad becoming antisocial? Was he jealous of our marriage? The signs were everywhere if I'd been willing to see them. When Julio mentioned his idea about flipping houses in the trendy Pearl District, Dad's fork would hover over his meatloaf, and he'd ask pointed questions. "How much experience do you have with construction permits, or what's your backup plan if the market shifts?" These weren't casual inquiries from a curious father-in-law. They were tests. Julio would laugh them off. "Your dad watches too much news, honey. All that doom and gloom economic talk." He'd squeeze my hand across the dinner table. "Some people just can't handle optimism." But Dad's questions became more specific. "How many properties have you successfully flipped? Can you show me the profit margins from your last project? What construction licenses do you hold?" Each question was like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and revealing. Julio's answers became increasingly vague, peppered with phrases like market research phase and building the right partnerships. I remember one particularly tense evening when Julio showed up wearing a new Rolex knockoff he'd bought online. Dad's eyes fixed on it immediately. "Nice watch," he said quietly. "Thanks. Good eye, Jair. It's all about projecting success, you know. Clients need to see you're serious." Dad nodded slowly, but I caught him checking his own modest Timex, the same one he'd worn for 15 years. Later, as we cleared dishes, he asked me privately, "How's your savings account looking, sweetheart?" "Fine, Dad. Why, just checking. Your mother always said to keep something set aside. You never know." I should have listened to him. I should have paid attention to the way his jaw tightened whenever Julio talked about money, or how his questions grew sharper each week. Dad wasn't being difficult or antisocial. He was trying to protect me from something he could see, but I was too blind to recognize. Those Sunday dinners weren't just family time for him. They were reconnaissance missions, gathering intelligence about the man who had married his daughter. Looking back now, I can see every warning sign Dad was trying to send me. The way he'd quietly excuse himself whenever Julio started talking about his big deals. How he'd change the subject when my husband mentioned expensive purchases. The careful way he'd ask about our joint finances, always probing gently but persistently. But I was so caught up in defending my marriage and proving that Dad was wrong to be suspicious that I missed the real message he was trying to send. He wasn't disapproving of Julio out of overprotectiveness or jealousy. He was trying to save me from a man whose interest in me might not be as genuine as I believed. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I was scrambling eggs when my phone rang with that shrill tone that somehow always signals bad news. "Miss Peterson, this is Dr. Martinez from Providence Medical Center. Your father was brought in about an hour ago. Heart attack. Massive. They'd done everything they could, but Dad was gone before the ambulance even reached the hospital. At 68, he'd simply collapsed in his kitchen while making his morning coffee." The French press was still warm when the paramedics arrived. I don't remember much about that first day, except sitting in the hospital parking lot sobbing into Julio's shoulder while he rubbed my back and made all the right soothing sounds. "I'm so sorry, baby. He was a good man. We'll get through this together." But even in my grief, I noticed how quickly Julio shifted into organizational mode, while I could barely function. He was already making lists, calling funeral homes, asking practical questions about Dad's affairs. "Don't worry about any of this," he kept saying. "I'll handle everything." At Peaceful Gardens Funeral Home, Julio charmed the director with his take-charge attitude. "We want something dignified but not over the top," he said, squeezing my hand. Cher was a practical man. Then, almost as an afterthought, he had quite a collection of vintage fishing equipment and those beautiful antique watches, real collector's pieces. The funeral director nodded politely, but I felt a strange chill. Why was Julio discussing Dad's belongings with a stranger? During the wake, Julio mingled effortlessly with Dad's coworkers and neighbors, accepting condolences and sharing stories I'd never heard him tell before. Shai was like a second father to me. He told Mrs. Targaryen from next door. We spent hours talking about his investment strategies. Brilliant mind for finance. That was news to me. Dad had never mentioned discussing investments with Julio. In fact, I couldn't recall them ever having a private conversation that lasted more than 5 minutes. He showed me his tackle collection just last month, Julio continued to Mr. Henderson from Dad's engineering firm. Those vintage reels alone must be worth thousands. And don't get me started on those Swiss timepieces he collected. I stared at my husband. Dad had never shown Julio his fishing gear or watches. Those were kept in his bedroom closet, items he'd treasured since my mother died but rarely displayed. How did Julio even know they existed? But grief has a way of making you question your own memories. Maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe Dad had shown him these things when I wasn't around. Maybe I was just overwhelmed and imagining problems where none existed. The funeral service was beautiful. Dad's engineering colleagues shared stories about his precision, his quiet leadership, his dedication to every project. Mrs. Targaryen talked about how he'd fixed her broken fence without being asked. Mr. Santos from the grocery store mentioned how Dad always tipped the young bag boys extra during Christmas. Through it all, Julio stood beside me, the perfect grieving son-in-law. He even delivered a touching eulogy about Dad's wisdom and generosity. People kept complimenting me afterward. You have such a wonderful husband. Shai would be so proud of how he's taking care of you. If only they knew that. Later that night, as I lay crying into my pillow, I heard Julio on the phone in the kitchen. His voice was hushed but carried through our thin walls. Yeah, it'll take a few weeks to sort through everything, but from what I saw, there's definitely value there. The watches alone, then silence, followed by, no, she doesn't know yet. Better to let her grieve first. I should have confronted him right then. But I was exhausted, heartbroken, and desperately wanting to believe that my husband was just being practical about necessary arrangements. Sometimes we convince ourselves of lies because the truth feels too devastating to face. I told myself he was probably talking to his brother about helping with estate logistics, that he was just being thorough, organized, caring. But deep down, something felt wrong about the way he'd cataloged Dad's possessions so quickly, how he'd spoken so familiarly about items he'd supposedly never seen. 4 weeks after Dad's funeral, his longtime attorney, Robert Matthews, called to arrange a meeting about the estate. I'd been dreading this conversation, assuming there would be just enough money to cover final expenses and maybe a small keepsake or two. Mrs. Peterson, could you and your husband come in Thursday afternoon? There are some important matters to discuss regarding your father's will. Julio insisted on driving, even though Matthews and Associates was only 10 minutes from our apartment. You're still too emotional to handle legal stuff, he said, adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror. Good thing I'll be there to help you understand everything. Robert Matthews had been Dad's attorney for over 20 years. A silver-haired man with kind eyes who had handled my parents' modest affairs since I was a teenager. His office smelled of old leather and coffee walls lined with law books that looked like they'd been there since the 1980s. Amanda, I'm so sorry for your loss, Matthew said, gesturing for us to sit in the worn chairs across from his massive oak desk. Your father was one of my most meticulous clients, always prepared, always thinking ahead. He opened a thick manila folder. Now I have some information that might come as a surprise. Your father's estate is considerably more substantial than you might have expected. I felt Julio's hand find mine, giving it what I thought was a supportive squeeze. How substantial? Julio asked, leaning forward slightly. Matthews adjusted his reading glasses. The total liquid assets come to approximately $850,000. The room went completely silent. I felt like someone had sucked all the air out of the space. $850,000. That was impossible. There must be some mistake, I whispered. Dad was an engineer, not a millionaire. He lived in that same small house for 30 years. He drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic. Matthew smiled gently. Your father was exceptionally disciplined with money, Amanda. He lived well below his means for decades. Between his salary, careful investments in mutual funds, and the life insurance policy from when your mother passed, he accumulated quite a nest egg. He wanted to ensure you'd be financially secure. Julio's grip on my hand tightened. 850,000, he repeated slowly, as if testing how the words felt in his mouth. The bulk of it is in conservative mutual funds, some in CDs, and about 50,000 in a money market account, Matthews continued. Very stable, very safe. Classic Guy R. Peterson approach. Nothing flashy, but steady growth over 30 years. I was still trying to process this information when Matthews pulled out another document. There are a few conditions attached to the inheritance, which I'll explain in detail. But first, are there any immediate questions? Julio's voice had a sharp edge I'd never heard before. Standard estate planning provisions, Matthew said casually. Your father was very thorough about ensuring his wishes were followed precisely. I sat there stunned into silence. $850,000. Dad had never given any indication he had that kind of money. He taught me to be frugal to save every penny to avoid debt. I'd assumed that was because we had to be careful, not because he was building wealth for my future. When can Amanda access the money? Julio asked his businessman persona, suddenly very much in evidence. Matthews looked at him with a slight frown. Well, that depends on the conditions I mentioned. Jair was very specific about when and how these funds should be distributed. Something in the attorney's tone made me look up from my shock. There was a gravity there, a weight to his words that suggested these weren't ordinary conditions. What kind of conditions? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Matthews glanced between Julio and me, then opened to a specific page in the legal documents. Perhaps we should review them together carefully. Your father put considerable thought into these provisions, and they're quite unique. The drive home from the attorney's office was eerily quiet. Julio gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. $850,000. The number kept echoing in my mind like a mantra I couldn't shake. Can you believe it? I finally said as we pulled into our apartment complex. All these years, Dad was secretly building this fortune for me. I had no idea. Julio parked and turned to face me, his eyes bright with an intensity I'd rarely seen. It's incredible, Amanda. Your father was obviously much smarter than anyone gave him credit for. He paused, then added with a grin, we're going to be able to do so much with that money. The word stuck in my mind, but I brushed off the discomfort. We were married after all. Of course he'd think of it as our money. But that night, everything changed. Julio spread real estate magazines across our kitchen table, circling luxury pickup trucks and camping equipment that cost more than my annual salary. Look at this beauty, he said, pointing to a Ford F-150 Raptor. 68,000 fully loaded, perfect for those weekend trips we've been talking about. I stared at the price tag. Julio, that's almost $70,000. Maybe we should be more conservative. Conservative? He laughed, but there was an edge to it. Baby, we just inherited almost $1 million. We can afford to live a little over the next few days. His suggestions became increasingly elaborate. A complete kitchen renovation with granite countertops and professional-grade appliances, a boat for fishing trips, high-end camping gear for the outdoor adventures. He'd suddenly developed an interest in designer watches to replace his knockoff Rolex. Your dad would want us to enjoy this money, he'd say whenever I expressed hesitation. He worked hard his whole life so you could have a better future. But something felt wrong about the way Julio was planning to spend Dad's life savings. This wasn't the careful, practical man I'd married 3 years ago. This was someone I'd never seen before. Impulsive, demanding, almost greedy. When I suggested we should invest most of the money and only spend a small portion, Julio's entire demeanor shifted. The supportive, grieving husband disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. You're being ridiculous. Amanda, he snapped when I mentioned wanting to keep the bulk of the inheritance in safe investments like Dad had done. This is our chance to really build something to upgrade our lives. Build what exactly, I asked. A real estate portfolio. That house flipping business I've been talking about. We could buy 3 or 4 properties, renovate them, and double our money within 2 years. I reminded him that he'd never actually flipped a house, that he had no construction experience, no contractor licenses, no proven track record. His response was to accuse me of not believing in him, of being negative and unsupportive, just like my father had been. The accusations stung because they were so unfair. Dad had never been unsupportive. He'd been cautious. There was a difference, though. I was only beginning to understand it. Julio started making unilateral decisions. He brought home brochures for expensive vacation packages to Costa Rica and Thailand. He scheduled appointments with boat dealers without asking me. He even put a deposit down on a motorcycle, claiming it was just to hold it until we could access the inheritance money. When I objected, he became sullen and withdrawn. The little kindnesses that had made our marriage pleasant, bringing me coffee in the morning, asking about my day, holding hands while watching TV, all disappeared. Our conversations became solely focused on money and how to spend it. You're acting like this inheritance is some kind of burden instead of a blessing, he said one evening after I'd suggested we wait 6 months before making any major purchases. Maybe grief is affecting your judgment more than you realize. It was a cruel thing to say, and it revealed something ugly about my husband that I'd never seen before. The mask was slipping, and underneath was someone I didn't recognize. Someone who saw my father's death not as a tragedy, but as a financial opportunity. The transformation was complete by the 6th week after Dad's death. The man I'd married, the one who used to bring me wildflowers from our evening walks, who'd rub my feet after long days at my accounting job, who'd make silly jokes just to see me smile, had been replaced by a stranger obsessed with spending money we didn't even have access to yet. Julio became increasingly aggressive about my selfishness regarding the inheritance. He'd bring up the money during every conversation, no matter how unrelated the topic. If I mentioned being tired from work, he'd say, "Well, once we get that money, you won't have to worry about that dead-end job anymore." If I suggested we stay home for dinner instead of going out, he'd respond with, "Why are you being so cheap when we're about to be rich?" The worst part was how he'd weaponize my grief against me. "You're not thinking clearly," became his favorite phrase whenever I disagreed with his spending plans. "Losing your father has obviously affected your judgment. Maybe you should let me handle the financial decisions for a while." Our apartment became a war zone of unspoken resentment. Julio would slam cabinets when I walked into the kitchen. He'd turn up the TV volume when I tried to talk to him. He stopped saying good morning or good night, treating me like a roommate he barely tolerated rather than his wife. The breaking point came when I discovered he'd been calling dealerships, telling them we were about to come into a large inheritance, and asking about financing options for expensive vehicles. He'd given them my name and phone number as a co-buyer. How could you do that without asking me? I confronted him after a BMW salesman called our home, asking when we wanted to schedule a test drive for the luxury SUV Julio had inquired about. I was being proactive. He shot back, getting our ducks in a row so we can move quickly once the money comes through. Some of us are thinking ahead instead of wallowing in the past. Wallowing in the past. Julio, my father, died 2 months ago. I'm still grieving. And I'm trying to help us build a future. He shouted, his face red with frustration. But you're so stuck in your father's cheap, paranoid mindset that you can't see the opportunities in front of us. That's when I knew something fundamental had broken in our relationship. He wasn't just disappointed about the money. He was angry at me for not immediately agreeing to spend it the way he wanted, as if I owed him something. The silent treatment began the next day. Julio would leave for work without saying goodbye, come home and go straight to his computer without acknowledging me, and eat dinner while scrolling through his phone instead of talking. When I tried to initiate conversation, he'd respond with single-word answers or heavy sighs that made it clear he found my presence irritating. But I noticed he was spending a lot of time on his laptop with the screen angled away from me. When I'd walk past, he'd quickly minimize windows or close the browser entirely. His phone, which used to sit casually on our coffee table, was now always face down and password protected. Jessica, my best friend since college, finally called me out on how withdrawn I'd become. "You haven't returned my texts in 2 weeks," she said when she showed up at my apartment unannounced one evening. "And you look terrible. What's going on?" I broke down and told her everything about the inheritance, about Julio's transformation, about how he'd become someone I didn't recognize. Jessica listened with growing concern, occasionally asking clarifying questions that made me realize how bad things had gotten. "Amanda," she said finally, "this isn't normal grief behavior. People don't usually become financial predators when their spouse inherits money. Has he always been like this about money?" I thought about it honestly for the first time. The answer was complicated. Julio had always been interested in get-rich schemes and expensive toys, but I'd attributed that to normal ambition. Now I wondered if there had been warning signs I'd missed, patterns I'd ignored, because I wanted to believe the best about the man I'd married. "Maybe your father saw something you couldn't," Jessica said gently. "Maybe all those questions he asked weren't jealousy or overprotectiveness. Maybe he was trying to protect you." That night, lying in bed next to my husband, who now felt like a stranger, I finally admitted to myself that our marriage might be in serious trouble, and that Dad's instincts about Julio might have been right all along. 3 weeks after my conversation with Jessica, I made a discovery that shattered what remained of my faith in my marriage. Julio had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went to take a shower, and I noticed multiple browser tabs still open. My eyes caught familiar names: Henderson and Associates Divorce Attorneys, Peterson Inheritance, Oregon Law and Spousal Rights, Inherited Assets. My hands trembled as I read through his browser history. Page after page of searches about divorce law in Oregon, how inherited assets are divided in marriage dissolution, and even specific queries, like wife inherited money before divorce and percentage spouse entitled Inheritance, Oregon. He wasn't just researching casually. Some of these sites had been bookmarked. There were downloaded PDFs with titles like Protecting Your Rights in High Asset Divorce and Maximizing Settlement Outcomes. The most recent search from just 2 hours earlier was for Best Divorce Attorneys, Portland, Oregon Inheritance Cases. I felt sick. While I'd been mourning my father and trying to save our marriage, Julio had been methodically planning our divorce. Not because he was unhappy, not because we had irreconcilable differences, but because he thought he could get a portion of Dad's money through legal proceedings. The shower was still running, so I quickly opened his email. What I found there was even worse. Draft emails to divorce attorneys never sent, but clearly composed. One particularly damning draft read, "My wife recently inherited a substantial sum, 850,000 plus, and is being unreasonable about sharing marital assets. I need to understand my rights and the best strategy for protecting my interests." Another draft, this one to his brother Marcus, was more honest about his motivations. Amanda's being impossible about the money, acting like it's all hers just because it came from her father. Marriage is supposed to be a partnership, right? I've been supporting her for 3 years and now she wants to hoard everything. My lawyer says I might be entitled to half if we split up. The water stopped running. I quickly closed everything and walked to the living room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When Julio emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later, hair perfectly styled and wearing his favorite cologne, I was sitting on the couch pretending to read a magazine. "You're up late," he said, not really looking at me. "Couldn't sleep," I managed to reply. He nodded and went to his laptop, closing it without checking anything. "I'm going to bed. Got an early meeting tomorrow." I lay awake all night staring at the ceiling and trying to process what I'd learned. My husband, the man I'd promised to love and honor, was planning to divorce me for money. Not because he was unhappy, not because we'd grown apart, but because he saw my inheritance as his ticket to a better life. The next morning, I called in sick to work and went to Jessica's apartment. I told her everything I'd discovered, and she listened with growing anger and disbelief. "That calculating bastard," she said when I finished. "Amanda, you realize he's been planning this since the day you found out about the inheritance, right? Maybe even since your father died, the pieces started falling into place. His sudden helpfulness with funeral arrangements, his detailed knowledge of Dad's possessions, his immediate shift to thinking about the inheritance as our money, his research into divorce law. Your father was trying to warn you," Jessica continued. "All those pointed questions, all that suspicion. He could see what Julio really was. I thought about Dad's careful probing during those Sunday dinners, how he'd ask about Julio's business experience, his financial history, his long-term plans, how he'd quietly inquire about our joint savings account and whether I kept any money separate. At the time, I thought he was being nosy or overprotective. Now I realized he was trying to assess whether my husband was trustworthy with money with my future." "What are you going to do?" Jessica asked. I didn't know. Part of me wanted to confront Julio immediately, to throw his browser history in his face and demand an explanation. But another part of me, the part that had been shaped by Dad's careful strategic thinking, told me to be smart about this, to gather more information before making any moves. "I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with," I said, "and I need to protect myself." That afternoon, I made my own appointment with an attorney, not for divorce, but to understand my rights and options. I also called Robert Matthews to ask some very specific questions about Dad's will and those mysterious conditions he'd mentioned. Actually, Amanda Matthews said when I explained my concerns, "Your father anticipated this exact situation. Perhaps you should come in again and we can review the will more thoroughly. There are provisions you haven't seen yet." As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope. Maybe Dad's protectiveness extended beyond the grave. Maybe he'd found a way to save me from a mistake that could have cost me everything. 6 weeks after discovering Julio's research into divorce attorneys, he finally dropped the pretense. I came home from work on a Thursday evening to find him sitting at our kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him, looking like a businessman about to deliver a presentation. "We need to talk," he said without looking up from the documents. I sat down my purse and sat across from him, my stomach already knotting with dread. The papers I could see now were printouts from legal websites and what looked like contact information for several law firms. "I've been thinking about our situation," he began, his tone eerily calm and businesslike. "About the inheritance, about our future, about what's best for both of us." "Okay," I said carefully. "I think we both know this marriage isn't working anymore." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were cold, calculating. "You've changed since your father died. You've become secretive, selfish, unreasonable about money. Frankly, you're not the woman I married." I stared at him, amazed by his audacity. "I'm not the one who's changed Julio. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't even have a rational conversation about our problems." He tapped one of the papers. "I've consulted with some legal professionals, and they've helped me understand that we're simply incompatible when it comes to financial planning and life goals." The clinical way he spoke about our marriage like it was a failed business venture made my skin crawl. This wasn't the passionate man who'd courted me with romantic dinners and weekend getaways. This was someone treating our relationship like a financial transaction that hadn't yielded the expected returns. What exactly are you saying? I asked, though I already knew. I want a divorce. He said it matter-of-factly like he was ordering coffee. I think it's the best solution for both of us. You can keep your father's money and be as miserly with it as you want. And I can find someone who shares my vision for building wealth and enjoying life just like that. My voice was barely a whisper. Amanda, be honest. Have you been happy these past few months? Because I haven't. Every conversation we have turns into an argument about money. You've made it clear that you see your inheritance as yours alone, not something we should build our future on together. The gaslighting was breathtaking. He was rewriting history to make me the villain in a story where he'd been plotting our divorce for financial gain. I never said the inheritance was mine alone, I said. I said we should be careful with it. Invest it wisely like my father did. I said we shouldn't blow it on expensive toys and risky business ventures, and that's exactly the kind of small-minded thinking that's destroying our marriage. His voice rose slightly, the first crack in his composed facade. Your father lived like a miser. He died alone in a tiny house with a fortune he never enjoyed. Is that what you want? To become just like him? Hearing him disparage Dad, the man who'd worked his entire life to provide for his family, who'd sacrificed his own comfort to leave me financially secure, was the final straw. My father wasn't a miser, I said, standing up. He was responsible. He was planning for my future, making sure I'd be okay, something you clearly never did. Julio stood too, and for the first time in our conversation, he looked genuinely angry. I've supported you for 3 years, Amanda. I've been the primary breadwinner while you worked your little accounting job. I've invested in our relationship and our future together. And now that there's real money on the table, you want to cut me out completely. I never said I wanted to cut you out. I said I wanted to be smart about it. Smart. He laughed bitterly. Smart would be recognizing that I'm the one with business sense. Smart would be trusting your husband to help you make good financial decisions. But you'd rather listen to the ghost of your paranoid father than to the man you married. The way he said paranoid father with such venom and contempt told me everything I needed to know about what he really thought of Dad and by extension what he thought of me. Fine, I said quietly. If that's what you want, then let's get divorced. His expression changed immediately, shifting from anger to something that looked almost like relief. Good. I'm glad we can be mature about this. I've already spoken to a few attorneys about the process. Since we don't have children and the inheritance complicates things, it might take a few months, but it should be fairly straightforward. He was so confident, so sure, that he'd get a piece of Dad's money through divorce proceedings. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. One question, I said as he gathered up his papers. When did you first start researching divorce attorneys? Before or after we found out about the inheritance? His pause was just a fraction too long. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question. Our problem started long before the inheritance. Amanda, the money just made them more obvious. It was a lie and we both knew it, but I didn't call him on it. Instead, I smiled. The first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. You're right. I said, let's proceed with the divorce. I'll call my own attorney tomorrow. As Julio walked toward our bedroom, probably to make more calls to his legal team, I felt something unexpected. Freedom. For the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood and exactly what I needed to do. The next morning, I called Robert Matthews and told him I needed to see the complete inheritance documents immediately. There was an urgency in my voice that must have concerned him because he cleared his schedule and agreed to meet me that afternoon. Before we go any further, I said as soon as I sat down in his office, I need to know about those conditions you mentioned. All of them. My husband wants a divorce, and I suspect it's related to the money. Matthews pulled out Dad's thick file and opened it to a section marked with red tabs. Your father was very explicit about wanting to protect you, Amanda. He came to see me about 8 months before he passed away with some very specific concerns about your marriage. My heart stopped. What kind of concerns? He never said anything directly negative about Julio, but he asked a lot of questions about asset protection in the event of divorce. He wanted to ensure that if anything happened to him, his life savings wouldn't end up in the wrong hands. Matthews pulled out a document I'd never seen before. Several pages of dense legal text with Dad's signature at the bottom. This is a supplemental trust provision that governs your inheritance. The basic structure is this. You can only access the full inheritance under 2 specific conditions. He adjusted his glasses and read directly from the document. Condition 1, you remain unmarried for at least 1 full year after your father's death. Condition 2, if you are married at the time of his death, you must be legally divorced and single for a minimum of 6 months before the trust releases the funds. I stared at him, my mind racing. What happens if I stay married? The entire inheritance goes to the Disabled Veterans Foundation of Oregon. Every penny. Your father was very clear that the money should help people who truly need it, rather than potentially enabling someone he considered untrustworthy. The room spun slightly as the implications hit me. Dad had essentially set up a test. If Julio truly loved me, he'd want me to stay married regardless of money. If he was only interested in the inheritance, he'd push for divorce and get nothing. He knew. I whispered somehow. He knew this would happen. Matthews nodded gravely. Your father spent months crafting this provision. He consulted with multiple attorneys to ensure it was legally bulletproof. He told me he hoped he was wrong about his suspicions. But if he wasn't, he wanted to make sure you'd be protected. Does Julio know about these conditions? Not unless you've told him. The basic will reading we did only covered the existence of the inheritance and mentioned that there were conditions. The specifics were to be revealed only to you, and only if certain circumstances arose. Matthews leaned forward. Amanda, has your husband been pressuring you about the money? I told him everything about Julio's transformation, his elaborate spending plans, his research into divorce attorneys, his ultimatum. Matthews listened with the expression of someone who'd seen this pattern before. Your father anticipated this exact scenario, he said when I finished. He even wrote a letter for you to be opened only if you requested to see the full trust conditions. He pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's careful handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Dad's voice seemed to speak from the page. My dearest Amanda, if you're reading this, it means my worst fears about Julio have come true. I pray I'm wrong, but if he's shown his true colors after learning about this inheritance, then you need to know something. Real love doesn't come with price tags. A man who truly loves you would never see your father's death as a financial opportunity. I've spent my entire life working to provide for you, and I'll be damned if I let someone use my death to take advantage of my daughter. The money is yours, sweetheart, but only when you're free from anyone who might want it more than they want you. Trust yourself. Trust your instincts. And remember that sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is protect his child from her own generous heart. I love you always, Dad. Tears streamed down my face as I folded the letter. Dad had known. He'd seen through Julio's charm and spotted the opportunist underneath. All those pointed questions, all that apparent disapproval. It had been love, pure protective love. So if I get divorced, I said, wiping my eyes, I get the full inheritance after 6 months of being single. Correct. And Julio, as your ex-husband, would have no legal claim to any of it since it was never technically yours during the marriage. The trust owns the money until the conditions are met. I started laughing, not from humor, but from the brilliant simplicity of Dad's plan. Julio thought he was manipulating me into a divorce that would give him access to the money. Instead, he was walking directly into a trap that would leave him with nothing. Mr. Matthews, I said I need you to prepare the divorce papers, and I want to make sure Julio understands exactly what he's giving up. I waited until the perfect moment to reveal the truth to Julio. He'd been smugly confident for 3 days since our divorce conversation, making calls to attorneys and even looking at apartments online. He clearly thought he'd outmaneuvered me, that his research and planning would pay off with a substantial settlement. The opportunity came when he brought home a bottle of expensive champagne Dom Perignon that cost more than our weekly grocery budget. What's the occasion? I asked, though I had a sick feeling I already knew. I spoke with Harrison and Associates today, he said, popping the cork with theatrical flair. They're confident about our case. Apparently, Oregon law is pretty favorable when it comes to asset division, even with inherited money. He poured 2 glasses and offered me one, to new beginnings and financial freedom. I accepted the glass, but didn't drink. Before we toast, there's something you should know about the inheritance. Some details that Mr. Matthews didn't share during our first meeting. Julio's smile faltered slightly. What kind of details? I pulled out the trust documents I'd gotten from Matthews. It turns out Dad was more thorough than either of us realized. The inheritance isn't actually mine yet. It's held in a trust with very specific conditions. What conditions? His voice had an edge now. I can only access the money if I'm single. Either I have to remain unmarried for 1 year after Dad's death, or if I'm married when he died, I have to get divorced and stay single for 6 months. I set the legal papers on the table between us. If I remain married, every penny goes to a veterans charity. The champagne glass slipped from Julio's hand, shattering on our kitchen floor. The expensive wine spread across the linoleum like a golden stain. That's impossible, he whispered. It's all right here in black and white. Dad set up the trust 8 months before he died. Apparently, he had concerns about my marriage. I met his eyes steadily, specifically concerns about you. Julio's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, anger, calculation, and finally panic. But that means our divorce won't get you anything. In fact, staying married won't get you anything either. The money was never legally mine to share. It belongs to the trust until I meet the conditions. He grabbed the papers and read them frantically, his eyes scanning the legal language as if he could find a loophole through sheer will. There has to be a way around this. We can contest it. We can claim undue influence or mental incompetence, or Dad was evaluated by 2 independent psychiatrists before setting up the trust. It's bulletproof. The change in Julio was immediate and dramatic. Gone was the cold, calculating businessman who demanded a divorce. In his place was a desperate man who suddenly realized his meal ticket had evaporated. "Amanda, baby, wait," he said, reaching for my hands. I pulled them away. "Maybe we're being hasty about this whole divorce thing. I mean, we've been through some tough times, but that doesn't mean we can't work things out. Really, 2 hours ago, you called me selfish and said I wasn't the woman you married. I was angry. People say things they don't mean when they're upset." His voice took on a wheedling quality I'd never heard before. "Look, we can get counseling. We can work through our problems. Marriage takes effort from both people, right?" It was pathetic watching him try to backpedal. The man who'd been researching divorce attorneys for weeks was now desperately trying to save a marriage he'd just declared dead. "What about all those things you said about my father, about him being paranoid and miserly?" "I was grieving too, Amanda. I said things I didn't mean. Your father was a good man, a smart man, maybe too smart for his own good." He laughed nervously. "I guess he really did know how to protect his daughter." Yes, he did. Julio spent the next hour trying every manipulation tactic in his arsenal. He apologized profusely for his behavior. He promised to be more supportive and understanding. He suggested we could use the inheritance money for charity work to help people less fortunate than ourselves. He even brought up starting a family, claiming that having children would bring us closer together. But it was too late. I'd seen behind the mask, and there was no going back. "The thing is, Julio," I said finally, "even if I wanted to reconcile, I don't think I could ever trust you again. You spent weeks planning our divorce in secret. You researched how to get money that wasn't even mine. You treated my father's death and my inheritance like a business opportunity. That's not fair. You called him paranoid for trying to protect me. But he was right, wasn't he? He saw exactly what you were." Julio's last attempt was to appeal to our history together. "We had good times, Amanda. Remember our trip to the coast? Remember how happy we were when we first got married? That was real. This money thing has poisoned everything. But we can get back to who we used to be." But I realize now that who we used to be was probably an illusion. Julio had been charming and attentive when he thought I was just a middle-class accountant with a modest future. The moment real money entered the picture, his true priorities had revealed themselves. Dad hadn't just protected my inheritance. He'd saved me from wasting my life with someone who would never truly love me, only what I could provide for him. The divorce process moved faster than I'd expected. Once Julio's attorney understood the trust conditions and realized there was no money to be gained, they advised him to accept a quick no-contest dissolution. Suddenly, the man who'd been planning to fight for half of our assets was eager to expedite the proceedings. Julio made one last desperate attempt at reconciliation the day before our final court date. He showed up at the apartment which I'd kept since his name wasn't on the lease, with flowers and a speech about how he'd realized his mistakes. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, standing in our doorway like a door-to-door salesman. "About us, about what's really important. Money isn't everything, Amanda. Love is." "You're absolutely right. I agreed. Money isn't everything. That's why I'm sure you'll be happy knowing that I'm planning to donate a significant portion of Dad's inheritance to charity once I receive it." His face went pale. "Donate it?" "The Disabled Veterans Foundation. Actually, the same organization that would have gotten it if I'd stayed married. It seems like the right thing to do, honoring Dad's wishes." I wasn't lying. I had been considering a substantial donation, though not the entire amount. That's very generous of you," he managed, though he looked like he might be sick. "I thought you'd approve since you said love is more important than money." The divorce was finalized on a rainy Tuesday in November, exactly 7 months after Dad's death. Julio didn't contest anything, and I kept our modest possessions and my maiden name, which I'd never changed. Anyway, as we left the courthouse separately, I felt lighter than I had in years. "How do you feel?" Jessica asked when I called her from the parking lot. "Free," I said, and meant it. The 6-month waiting period began immediately. According to the trust conditions, I had to remain single and not cohabitate with anyone romantically for 180 consecutive days before the inheritance would be released. It was like a cooling-off period, a chance to make sure I was making decisions based on my own judgment rather than emotional rebound. I used the time well. I threw myself into work, earning a promotion and a significant raise at the accounting firm. I started therapy to process not just Dad's death and my divorce, but the deeper patterns of people leasing and conflict avoidance that had made me vulnerable to Julio's manipulation. Your father sounds like he was incredibly wise, my therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen observed during one of our sessions. He created a situation where you could discover the truth about your marriage without his interference. That takes tremendous restraint and love. I also began exploring interests I'd suppressed during my marriage. Julio had always dismissed my love of hiking as boring, and my interest in photography as expensive and impractical. Suddenly, I had weekends free to drive to the Columbia River Gorge with my camera capturing sunrise shots of waterfalls and forest trails. The hardest part of the waiting period wasn't being alone. It was dealing with Julio's periodic attempts at contact. He'd text me occasionally with updates about his life, mentioning how much he missed me and asking if I wanted to get coffee just as friends. Each message felt like a test of my resolve. I keep thinking about that weekend we spent in Cannon Beach. Read one text. Remember how perfect everything was? I did remember. We'd walked along the shore at sunset, and Julio had been unusually thoughtful and romantic. At the time, I'd thought it was spontaneous affection. Now I wondered if he'd been feeling guilty about something, or if he'd been trying to secure my loyalty before making some financial ask I'd forgotten about. I heard you got a promotion, said another message. I always knew you were capable of more than you realized. I'm proud of you. The presumption that he had any right to be proud of my achievements annoyed me more than his attempts at reconciliation. He'd spent 3 years subtly undermining my confidence, suggesting that my accounting job was cute, but not serious, that I lacked the ambition for real success. Now that I was succeeding without him, he wanted credit for believing in me. I stopped responding to his messages entirely. On a cold February morning, exactly 6 months and 1 day after our divorce was finalized, I received a call from Robert Matthews. Amanda, congratulations. As of today, you meet all the trust conditions. Would you like to schedule an appointment to transfer the inheritance into your personal accounts? I was sitting in my car outside a hiking trail about to start a solo trek through Forest Park. The morning mist was rising through the Douglas firs and everything felt possible. Yes, I said. I'd like that very much. That afternoon, I became the official owner of $850,000. Free and clear. No strings attached. No one else's claim on it. No need to justify my decisions to anyone. The first thing I did was write a check to the Disabled Veterans Foundation for $100,000. It felt like the right way to honor Dad's memory and the organization he'd chosen as his backup beneficiary. The second thing I did was quit my job and start planning the rest of my life. With my newfound financial freedom, I made the kind of bold decisions I'd never allowed myself to even dream about during my marriage. The first was leaving Portland entirely. I'd always loved the Oregon coast, but had never been able to afford living there. Julio had dismissed my fascination with seaside towns as impractical romantic nonsense, insisting we needed to stay close to the city for his business opportunities. I found a charming cottage in Manzanita, a small coastal community where the forest meets the ocean. The house was nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a tiny kitchen with windows overlooking the beach, but it felt like paradise compared to our cramped Portland apartment. The previous owners had installed skylights throughout, filling every room with natural light that changed throughout the day as clouds moved across the Pacific sky. The purchase process was surreal. After years of carefully budgeting every expense, I could simply write a check for the full amount. No mortgage, no monthly payments, no stress about making ends meet. The house was mine completely and forever. My first morning in Manzanita, I made coffee and sat on the small deck overlooking the beach. The sun was rising over the coastal mountains behind me, painting the ocean in shades of gold and pink. Seagulls called to each other as they dove for fish in the surf. It was the most peaceful moment I'd experienced since Dad's death. That same week, I visited the local animal shelter. I'd always wanted dogs, but Julio claimed to be allergic and had refused to even discuss it. Dogs are expensive, messy, and tie you down, he'd said whenever I brought up the subject. We can travel more freely without pets. At the Timuc County Animal Shelter, I met Luna and Max, a bonded pair of rescue dogs who'd been surrendered when their elderly owner moved to assisted living. Luna was a gentle golden retriever mix with graying fur around her muzzle, and Max was a spirited beagle whose tail never stopped wagging. They'd been at the shelter for 3 months because most people wanted puppies, not senior dogs with medical needs. They come as a package deal, the volunteer warned me. Luna has arthritis and needs daily medication, and Max is diabetic and requires insulin shots twice a day. That's fine, I said, already falling in love with their sweet, hopeful faces. I have time to take care of them properly. Bringing Luna and Max home filled the cottage with a warmth and energy I hadn't realized I'd been missing. They followed me from room to room, grateful for attention and affection. Max claimed the sunny spot by the kitchen window as his favorite napping place, while Luna preferred the living room rug where she could keep an eye on everything. With the immediate necessities of housing and companionship taken care of, I turned my attention to something I'd been dreaming about for years: art. During our marriage, Julio had been dismissive of my interest in painting. Expensive hobby for someone who's not naturally artistic, he'd said, when I mentioned wanting to take classes. Maybe when we're more financially stable. I enrolled in watercolor classes at the local community center, where I met other residents who'd been drawn to Manzanita for its natural beauty and slower pace of life. My instructor, Margaret, was a retired art teacher from Seattle who'd moved to the coast to focus on her own painting. "You have a good eye for color and composition," she told me after my first few attempts at capturing the beach landscape. "Have you considered oil painting? It might suit your style better." I bought professional grade supplies without checking the price tags, something that would have been unthinkable during my marriage. Canvas, brushes, paints, and easel for the deck where I could work while watching the ocean. The creative freedom was intoxicating. My days fell into a rhythm that felt natural and healing. Morning walks on the beach with Luna and Max, during which I'd collect interesting pieces of driftwood and shells. Afternoons spent painting or reading in the sunny living room. Evenings cooking simple meals while jazz played softly in the background. I joined the local photography club and discovered that my pictures of coastal wildlife and landscapes had improved dramatically since I'd had time to really study light and composition. The club organized weekend trips to places like Crater Lake and the Columbia River Gorge. Adventures I never could have taken during my marriage because Julio would have complained about the cost and time away from his projects. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Not someone's wife, not someone's daughter, just Amanda. A woman with her own interests, her own home, her own choices. The isolation that had initially worried me turned out to be exactly what I needed. I was learning to enjoy my own company, to trust my own judgment, to make decisions based on what felt right to me rather than what someone else expected. 6 months into my new life, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anxious about money, worried about someone else's approval, or questioned whether I was being too selfish for wanting something. Dad's inheritance hadn't just given me financial security, it had given me the space and time to rediscover who I was when I wasn't trying to please anyone else. Standing on my deck one evening, watching Luna and Max play in the surf while the sunset painted the sky in impossible shades of orange and purple, I felt Dad's presence strongly. He'd known exactly what he was doing with that trust. He'd given me more than money. He'd given me back my life. 2 years after moving to Manzanita, I was sitting on my deck painting the morning light on the ocean when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart sank when I realized it was Julio, texting from what must have been a new phone. "Hi, Amanda. I know it's been a while, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I heard through mutual friends that you're living at the coast now. That sounds amazing. I always loved the beach. Maybe we could meet for coffee sometime and catch up. I missed talking to you." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. There was nothing left to say to him. I'd moved on completely, and I suspected his sudden interest in reconnecting had more to do with curiosity about my current financial situation than any genuine desire to rekindle our friendship. A month later, Jessica visited me for a long weekend. She'd kept in touch throughout my transformation, cheering my victories and offering support during the harder moments of adjusting to single life. "You look incredible," she said as we walked along the beach with Luna and Max. "Not just happy you look like yourself again, like the Amanda I knew in college before." "Well, before Julio, I feel like myself," I said. For the first time in years, any regrets about the divorce, about how everything played out, I considered the question seriously. None. The only regret I have is that it took me so long to see what Dad was trying to tell me. That evening, as we shared dinner and wine while watching the sunset, Jessica brought up something I'd been wondering about too. "Have you heard anything about Julio lately through the Portland network?" "A little," I admitted. "Marcus mentioned last time we talked that he's been struggling. Apparently. He went through a series of failed business ventures after our divorce. The house flipping thing never materialized, and he lost quite a bit of money on some cryptocurrency speculation." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Cryptocurrency? That doesn't sound like him." "It does if you realize he was always looking for get-rich-quick schemes. He just hit it better when we were married." I sipped my wine thoughtfully. The last I heard, he was working as a sales manager for a car dealership and living in a studio apartment. "Do you feel sorry for him?" "Sometimes," I said honestly. But then I remember how he treated me during those last months of our marriage, how he planned our divorce behind my back, how he talked about Dad. I shook my head. He made his choices. What I didn't tell Jessica was that Julio had actually tried to contact me several times over the past 2 years. Birthday messages, holiday greetings, occasional updates about his life that felt like fishing expeditions to see how I was doing financially. Each message revealed the same thing. He was still thinking about the money he'd lost access to, still wondering if there might be some way back into my life and, by extension, my inheritance. The most telling message had come 6 months ago. I've been doing a lot of growing and self-reflection since our divorce. I realize now how poorly I handled everything with your father's inheritance. I was grieving too and made mistakes. If you're ever open to talking, I'd love the chance to apologize properly and maybe work toward being friends again. It was the closest he'd ever come to admitting what he'd done. But even that apology was calculated and self-serving. He wasn't sorry for hurting me. He was sorry for losing access to the money. 3 years after Dad's death, on the anniversary of his passing, I visited his grave in Portland. I'd made this pilgrimage every year, bringing fresh flowers and spending time talking to him about how my life had evolved. "I finally understand what you were trying to do," I said, arranging the daffodils he'd always loved near his headstone. "You weren't just protecting the money. You were protecting me from settling for someone who didn't really love me." The wind rustled through the old oak trees in the cemetery, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice. "You deserve better than that, sweetheart. You always did." "I'm happy, Dad," I continued, really genuinely happy. "I have a home I love, work that fulfills me, friends who value me for who I am. I'm learning to paint, I'm traveling, I'm making choices based on what I want rather than what someone else expects." The inheritance didn't just give me financial security. It gave me the chance to discover who I really am. As I drove back to Manzanita that evening, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. The scared, uncertain woman who'd sat in that lawyer's office 3 years ago barely resembled the confident, independent person I'd become. Dad's inheritance had been about more than money. It had been about recognizing my own worth, learning to trust my instincts, and understanding that real love doesn't come with conditions or calculations. He'd seen through Julio's charm to the opportunist underneath, and he'd crafted a way to protect me without controlling me. The trust hadn't forced me to get divorced. It had simply created a situation where Julio's true priorities would reveal themselves. If he'd genuinely loved me, he would have been happy for my good fortune and supportive of careful financial planning. Instead, he'd shown his hand by immediately viewing my inheritance as his opportunity. Now settled in my cottage with Luna snoring softly at my feet and Max curled up in his favorite chair, I felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for Dad's wisdom and foresight. Gratitude for the financial security that allowed me to make choices based on what felt right rather than what I could afford. Gratitude for the painful but necessary experience of learning who I could trust and who I couldn't. Most of all, I was grateful to finally understand that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely, and that sometimes the most loving thing someone can do is give you the space and resources to save yourself. As for the others in my story, Julio continues to work at the car dealership, still sending occasional messages that I no longer read. Jessica remains my closest friend and visits twice a year. Robert Matthews retired but still sends me holiday cards. And Dad, wherever he is, finally has the peace of knowing his daughter is exactly where she needs to be. Free, independent, and surrounded by love that asks for nothing in return except the chance to be genuine.